Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. At 4:27 a.m. on July 25, 1988, a North Carolina dispatcher received a call from a woman who spoke very softly, saying, "This is an emergency. I need the police and an ambulance. My husband may be dying, and I think I may be too." When officers arrived, they found a horrific scene. There was blood everywhere in the bedroom, even on the ceiling. 44-year-old Lieth Von Stein was lying on the floor of her bedroom, suffering from life-threatening injuries. She would miraculously survive. Bonnie's husband, 42-year-old Lieth, was lying dead on the bed. There was so much blood. It was clear that someone had viciously attacked the Von Stein couple, but whoever was responsible was no longer at the scene. The house was empty, except for Bonnie's daughter Angela, who had not been touched, even though she was only feet away from her mother's bedroom. And because it had been dark during the attack, Bonnie couldn't remember much about the intruder, just that he was wearing something over his face and was dressed in dark clothing from head to toe. Nearly a year would pass before the intruder was identified and the case was solved, and no one would be more shocked by the truth than Lieth Von Stein. Welcome to episode 182, The Von Stein Attack, also known as the Dungeons and Dragons murder. 44-year-old Bonnie Stein could barely get the words out. Would she die on the phone because they couldn't hear her? The Washington, North Carolina dispatcher was trying, and Bonnie, ever polite, apologized. She explained that the intruder may still be in the house, and when the operator asked for Bonnie's name, at first she could only respond, "I am bleeding." Bonnie had already struggled so hard just to get to the operator. In 1988, Little Washington wasn't equipped with 911, so she had to press a bunch of buttons on her phone until she got to an operator who connected her with the police. And she had been on the floor. She had dragged herself to the nightstand and pulled the phone down on top of herself with a cord, and then tried 911 before she remembered, and then started pressing random numbers until she finally got an operator. She managed to tell the dispatcher her name and address, and she explained that she and her husband had been attacked. She thought he was dead and she might be dying. The dispatcher assured her that she had help on the way and kept Bonnie talking. When the police arrived at the Von Stein home, the intruder was gone, but the scene was horrific. Police were initially startled by all the cats. They seemed to be all over the place. There would be 13 in all and one rooster. Bonnie was a member of the Humane Society and fostered the cats. And I guess the rooster, even though she didn't live on a farm. But animal-loving Bonnie thought nothing of bringing him in the house for the night. Once police maneuvered around the animals, they went upstairs to the bedroom on the right, as Bonnie had told the dispatcher. Despite her deadly injuries, Lieth Von Stein kept her wits about her. Police found the bedroom was absolutely covered in blood, and there seemed to be two bodies, one on the bed and one on the floor. The body on the floor was Bonnie, the woman who had called for help. She was alive, but barely. She had been stabbed in the chest and beat about the head with something like a baseball bat. The officers called dispatch again, asking where the ambulance was. The situation was dire. In nothing short of a miracle, Bonnie received medical treatment in time and survived. But unfortunately, her husband wasn't so lucky. 42-year-old Lieth Von Stein was dead. He had died before the emergency responders had arrived. Lieth had also been beaten and stabbed. His body lay on the bed, surrounded by a pool of red blood. Someone had viciously attacked Bonnie and Lieth Von Stein. Someone angry, someone deranged. But whoever it was had fled the scene. And since Bonnie had been asleep when the attack started, she hadn't gotten a good look at the assailant. It was dark and she didn't have her glasses on. She was very nearsighted, so even if she hadn't been in the midst of an attack, she couldn't see clearly, especially in the dark. The only thing she could recall with certainty was that he was wearing something over his face, and he was dressed in dark clothing from head to toe. For almost a year, no one knew who brutally murdered Lieth Von Stein and almost killed Bonnie Von Stein. Until finally, after 11 months, the attacker was unmasked. The case was solved, and the detectives who had relentlessly investigated for months and months probably celebrated. An officer might have received a well-deserved pat on the shoulder. Maybe a supervisor bought everyone a round of drinks after work. But Bonnie Von Stein was not celebrating. First of all, because of how long it took to get justice and how she had been treated by law enforcement. It was hurtful, and the early investigation was dismal. But more importantly, the man who had viciously attacked her, the man who had murdered her husband, the man who had single-handedly decimated her entire life, was someone she never would have suspected. Lieth Peter Von Stein was born on March 16th of 1946 to his mother Marie and his father Howard in New York City. He was an only child, and because of that, he was a little spoiled. His mother Marie doted on him endlessly. Still, he was a good kid. He just knew from a young age that things were always going to go his way. Later, Lieth, a prolific jokester, would say, "They only had one because they were afraid to risk having another one like me." When Lieth was a baby, the small Von Stein family moved from Queens to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a city of over 250,000 people in central North Carolina. Lieth's dad, Howard, was going to help out with his brother-in-law's dry cleaning business. It was called Camel City, and shortly after the Von Steins joined the business, Camel City became wildly successful. By the mid-60s, Camel City Laundry and Cleaners had several branches across the nation and over 100 employees. Lieth's dad, who had started as a general manager, had become a part owner, and the Von Stein family was doing really well financially. And they were also doing really well in general. Lieth and his parents lived in a quaint home in a nice part of town. They went to church every Sunday. And Lieth was thriving. He was a bright kid, and high school was a breeze. In 1964, he graduated, and then he attended North Carolina State University to study engineering. But that didn't last long. Lieth, a sheltered child, floundered with the newfound freedom that came with college. Plus, engineering school was difficult. And it was even more difficult if you partied hard and as often as Lieth did. By his junior year in 1967, he had flunked out. In the late 60s, it was the height of the Vietnam War. As a result, in 1968, 22-year-old Lieth Von Stein was drafted into the U.S. Army. But instead of getting shipped off to Southeast Asia, Lieth somehow landed a safer assignment in Germany. Still, he left the Army as soon as he could. He had only served 2 years, but that was fine with him. He never saw himself being happy with a lifelong career in the military. In fact, Lieth's brief military experience made him disheartened about the government and the Vietnam War. According to Jerry Bledsoe's Blood Games, Lieth would often ask his friends, "Why are we here? What are we doing?" In 1970, 24-year-old Lieth enrolled in Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina. Although he really did love numbers, he had been burned by his experience studying engineering at North Carolina State. This time around, Lieth wanted to study business, and that's exactly what he did. In between getting high and drunk with his friends, of course. But that was okay. Lieth managed to balance his business schoolwork and still enjoy himself. Lieth's friends described him as offbeat yet charming. He was smart and clever with a quick wit that would leave even the most stone-faced professor grinning. And Lieth wasn't shy. If he had something to say, he would say it, damn the consequences. And if you had something to say, you'd better be ready to defend your opinion, because Lieth was known for playing devil's advocate until long after the cows came home. One of Lieth's friends told author Jerry Bledsoe in an interview he would absolutely take it to the hilt, make you prove your point. Another friend said he liked to look at life in the absurd. He was a structured person, but he was also a very creative person. Lieth had a tremendous imagination. In December of 1972, Lieth graduated from Guilford College with his business degree. During college, he had developed an interest in computers, and so he merged his love for business and computers by accepting a programming position at Intagon, a North Carolina insurance company. They needed a computer genius, and Lieth was just the right guy. While working at Intagon, Lieth met a woman named Bonnie Lou Bates Pritchard. She, like Lieth, was incredibly smart. But unlike Lieth, Bonnie was very shy, and she always had been. Bonnie Lou Bates had been raised along her sisters in rural Davidson County, which was only a few miles outside of Winston-Salem. She loved reading and she loved animals. And in high school, Bonnie had been on the newspaper staff and in the drama club. But still, she was an incredibly shy woman. She was quiet, and as an adult, it could make her seem unemotional. Her daughter Angela inherited the same reserved trait. Bonnie was extremely close to her parents, George and Polly Bates, and would lean on them tremendously after the attack. They were salt of the earth people, and she had always leaned on them. Bonnie had a hard life starting out as an adult. After she graduated from high school in 1962, she began working with computers at Intagon. And 5 years later, in 1967, she married her first husband. Not Lieth, but a different man. His name was Stephen Pritchard. And Stephen was younger than Bonnie. He was 18 years old and still in high school when he and Bonnie tied the knot. She was 23 years old. After their honeymoon, Stephen returned to high school to finish up his senior year, and Bonnie went back to work at Intagon. We would be horrified at this today. It would have been considered mildly scandalous then. But Bonnie Pritchard wasn't well known in their town, and neither was her young husband. So their marriage went unnoticed, or at least unremarked upon, and they started a family almost immediately. A son named Christopher Wayne Pritchard came almost 9 months after their marriage in 1968, and second, a daughter named Angela Christine Pritchard in 1970. Eventually, financial turmoil got the best of their relationship, and Bonnie and Stephen were officially divorced in November of 1973. For the record, because I know I'll get comments, this is the exact age difference between me and my husband. But we got married in our 30s. There is a difference, and I, of course, understand that. But marrying a kid in high school would only be okay in the era that Bonnie and Stephen did it. And marrying a high school kid certainly seemed to come with the consequence of him being too immature to be a husband or father. Stephen quickly left his family, and Bonnie was on her own, trying to feed 2 small kids. There were a couple of very lean years as Bonnie worked all the time, and the Pritchard children either stayed in daycare or with Bonnie's parents. Bonnie tended to be overpermissive with her kids because she felt guilty, something she kept up even when they were older. But not too long after her divorce, Bonnie and Lieth, who knew each other from working together at Intagon, began dating. But nobody knew about it. For reasons unknown, Lieth had a history of being very secretive about his relationships with women. Maybe that's because while Lieth was a very charismatic guy, he wasn't traditionally attractive. And so asking women out was more of a struggle than he probably liked to admit. Perhaps he kept his relationships a secret to ensure he wouldn't be embarrassed if he was later rejected. It could also have been due to Bonnie's reserved, shy nature. She was a very private woman. She worked hard to raise her kids, and she wasn't big on shows of affection. But in a way, that made her the yin to Lieth's yang. They were well matched. So Bonnie and Lieth were probably dating long before their friends and family realized it in the mid-70s. By 1977, Lieth told his friends that he was thinking about marrying Bonnie. At that point, Lieth had left Intagon for greener pastures, but he and Bonnie were still talking regularly. The only thing that held him back from popping the question was Bonnie's children, Christopher and Angela. At this point, Angela was 9 years old and Chris was around 11. And Lieth hadn't spent much time with either of them. But Lieth knew he wanted Bonnie. He would figure out the rest like he always did. On August 17, 1979, 33-year-old Lieth married 35-year-old Bonnie. And fortunately, both of Bonnie's kids, Chris and Angela, seemed to be big fans of their new stepfather. According to authors Jerry Bledsoe and Joe McGinnis, who would both write famous books on the case, the beginning of the new family was a fairly peaceful transition, helped by the fact that Lieth traveled a lot for work. Bonnie's kids didn't have to accept their new dad all at once, and they now had more of their mother's attention. It really seemed like everything was falling into place. Not long after the wedding, Lieth became the chief auditor of a textile company called National Spinning Company in Washington, North Carolina. Known as Little Washington, it was 200 miles east of Winston-Salem, but the move would be worth it. This was an executive position, which meant a lot more money. So Lieth, Bonnie, Chris, and Angela packed their bags and moved 3 hours east. Washington, North Carolina is a small town, just like its nickname suggests. The type of place where everyone knows everyone and no one locks their doors. In the 1980s, there were less than 9,000 residents, and National Spinning Company, the textile company Lieth now worked for, was the city's largest employer. The family settled in at 110 Lawson Road in a neighborhood known as Smallwood. It was the city's most exclusive area, as in, anybody who was somebody lived in Smallwood. And since the National Spinning Company was such a big deal in Little Washington, Lieth's role as the chief auditor meant he was a somebody. And Lieth didn't take that lightly. He worked hard, socialized just as hard, and quickly became a well-respected pillar of the Little Washington community. From the outside looking in, the Von Steins seemed to be living the American dream. They had money, they had friends, they had family. What else could you possibly need? But Lieth was unsatisfied. Friends of Lieth's told A&E reporters that he sometimes said he wanted Bonnie's now teenaged children to move out of the house. He spent a lot of money on the children, but they didn't seem to appreciate it. He bought Chris a 1965 white vintage Mustang, souped up so you could hear the muffler coming from blocks away. But Chris didn't seem grateful enough for Lieth. Nothing he did seemed like enough. It was the same with Angela. But as far as his teenaged stepkids moving out, I'm not sure where Lieth thought they would go, as Stephen Pritchard had never been much of a father to his kids. He wasn't even living in the state at this point and only saw his kids a couple of times a year. Joe McGinnis wrote that Angela told Pritchard to his face that he wasn't her father and she considered Lieth her dad. You have to wonder if sometimes it was just plain old communication issues with Lieth and his stepkids. And you can't buy teenagers, even though it might seem like you can. Nothing replaces spending time with your stepkids to get to know, trust, and accept each other. But Lieth was a very busy man. He worked hard and he demanded respect from his stepchildren, despite not being very close to them. Things were especially difficult with Chris, who was a student at Washington High School. Lieth was frustrated by his stepson's laid-back attitude, and he was disappointed that Chris didn't get good grades despite having the intellect. Lieth saw potential in Chris, but it felt like Chris didn't see the potential in himself. Chris's peers described him as moody, different, reserved, and weird. And Chris, by many accounts, was desperate for attention. He would do anything and everything to get it. Despite how Bonnie tried to connect with Chris, he was still always that kid in daycare, starved for love. So he acted out a lot. One day, he arrived at school with a python around his neck, just casually wearing it like a scarf. Chris put so much time into being noticed, it's no wonder he didn't have any energy left for homework. His wild behavior didn't jive well with Lieth, who was a disciplined guy, and Lieth hated spending money on Chris just to watch him squander it away. But despite their challenges, things were looking up in June of 1987. Chris had just graduated from high school and started college at North Carolina State University. He was going to study political science. And Lieth was starting to see some promise in Chris. He even offered to pay Chris's tuition and give him a modest allowance. It was $50 a week, which is $125 in today's money. Definitely enough to cover groceries and gas money. But that's not what Chris was spending the money on, and it was never enough money. According to McGinnis, he also had credit cards he used that Bonnie would then quietly pay off. Or he would just ask his mom for more money, and she rarely denied him. In the fall of 1987, Chris was living on campus, and his first semester grades were okay. But by the end of the spring semester, his grades were declining again, and Lieth was livid. Chris was back to his old ways, and he suspected that Chris's lackluster performance had to do with his recreational drug use. Even though Lieth was a bit of a partier in college, he couldn't stomach watching Chris make the same mistakes, at least not on his dime. Lieth threatened to cut Chris off financially, and their relationship rapidly deteriorated from there. And Lieth might have been a former partier, but I'm not sure he had ever been on the same level as Chris. It wasn't just smoking pot and drinking. Chris was doing cocaine and was heavily into LSD. It's difficult to skate through even freshman classes when you're tripping balls every other day. In May of 1988, Chris was able to finish his first year of college by the skin of his teeth. Then he enrolled in a few summer courses, maybe as a show of faith so that Lieth would trust him. Or maybe Chris needed to catch up on his credits so he could graduate on time. Either way, 20-year-old Chris finally seemed like he had his nose to the grindstone. Seemed being the operative word, and tensions were still high between Chris and Lieth. At the beginning of summer of 1988, Chris returned to Bonnie and Lieth's home for a visit. They argued about Chris's academic performance the entire time. A few times, Chris and Lieth almost came to blows. By the end of it all, Bonnie decided she would be the one to handle how to discipline Chris. Clearly, Lieth and Chris could not be trusted to handle the situation without becoming violent. That same summer, 18-year-old Angela was supposed to visit Chris for the 4th of July holiday. She drove to North Carolina State in Raleigh, but Chris was nowhere to be found. Angela, who was concerned, called Chris's phone, but he didn't pick up. Bonnie tried to reach him too, but still, Chris was gone. Out of her mind with worry, Bonnie did what no mother ever wants to do. She filed a missing person report for her son. And shortly after that, Chris reached out. He was fine, nothing to worry about, sorry for all the trouble. Now it was Bonnie's turn to be livid. Where had Chris been for 3 days? Chris fed Bonnie some bullshit about where he was, but it was clear he was lying. According to Bledsoe's Blood Games, during this incident, Lieth told Chris, "If you're getting involved with drugs, I'm going to kick your ass." But Chris wasn't worried. From his perspective, Lieth had a big bark, but not much bite. Following this debacle, Bonnie and Lieth were sick of Chris's shit. They decided to keep a tighter leash on him, or they said they would. The only consequence Chris actually faced was that now he had to tell his parents how he was spending their money. But they still gave him the money. Everyone raises their kids differently, but I think at this point, Chris was a legal adult. Rather than continue to bang their heads against a wall, why not tell Chris he had to get a job to pay for his lifestyle? Still pay for his tuition as long as he was passing his classes, but otherwise he would be on his own. He would either grow up or flounder and learn a lesson. You would think Bonnie, who had married an immature high school kid, would see this. But we are often blind to our own children, and parents always want better for their kids than they had themselves. It's part of why Chris's partying drove Lieth nuts. He saw him making the same mistakes he had, and Bonnie would never have the heart to actually cut off one of her kids. On Friday, July 22nd, Chris came home again, and he spent the night. On Saturday morning, he left to go see some friends. He returned later that day, made some hamburgers, and ate dinner with the family. After dinner, Chris announced he was headed back to the university. Bonnie and Chris stood by his car as they said their final goodbye. And according to Blood Games, that's when Bonnie noticed something odd. Chris's car was missing its very nice, high-tech radio. Chris explained to his mother that someone had stolen it. He hadn't told her because he didn't want her to worry. But Bonnie could smell the lie from a mile away. Had Chris pawned it off for drug money? Who knows? Bonnie was tired. This was just one more way that Chris was going to piss off Lieth. She let Chris have this one and didn't even tell Lieth. And Chris made his way back to school. On Sunday, July 24th, Lieth and Bonnie went out to dinner. It was a nice time. The food was good, the wine was better. Lieth and Bonnie talked about their future, their hopes, their dreams, their future retirement. According to Blood Games, Lieth told Bonnie that he would have no life if not for her, no reason to live without her. When the two returned home, Lieth went to bed, but Bonnie stayed up. She had been looking forward to watching a made-for-TV movie about Ted Bundy called The Deliberate Stranger. It aired that night. At about 11 p.m., she turned in for the night. She checked on her cats, the rooster, and locked all the doors. Then she joined Lieth in bed, and after reading for a while, she went to sleep around midnight. Hours later, Bonnie was jolted awake. Lieth was screaming, and a dark figure was standing at the foot of their bed. A man who was attacking Lieth. Bonnie reached out for Lieth, but inadvertently got in the way of the attacker's blows. Then the attacker started striking Bonnie as well. In the dark without her glasses, and groggy from sleep, Bonnie wasn't sure what was going on. She lost consciousness. Moments later, she woke up. She was on the floor now. The intruder was standing near her feet, still striking her with something. After a while, the attacker clearly thought Bonnie was dead and left the room. She was frantic. Her daughter Angela was in a nearby bedroom, but Bonnie couldn't get up, and she lost consciousness again. The next time Bonnie woke up, she reached for Lieth's fingers. They were limp, but she thought she heard him breathing. Although she was panicked and disoriented, Bonnie knew she had to call for help. She managed to drag herself to the bedside table where the phone was and pull the phone by the cord until it fell on top of her. She dialed 911, but there was no 911 emergency line in Little Washington. So Bonnie forced herself to be logical and pressed random numbers. She hung up when she heard busy signals until finally, at 4:27 a.m., she was connected to an operator from Beaufort County Central Communications. Side note, it is pronounced Beaufort. This is North Carolina, not South Carolina. So I hope the pronunciation police remember that before they try to come for me this time. Thank you to local listener Ainsley who wrote in and confirmed this for me. Back to the story. As Bonnie spoke with the operator, she became more and more incoherent. But the operator was able to understand enough to get Bonnie's address and send help. When the responding officers arrived, they found the Von Stein's front door was locked, but the back door had been forced open. Someone had cut through the back door screen so that they could unlock the door from the inside. But they had broken the window beside the door, a double-pane storm window, instead of just breaking the small window on the door. Later, when a detective thought he would test a theory, he could barely reach the handle from the window, even with his feet dangling off the porch, and he was 6 feet tall. To him, this looked staged. The front door had been locked, so this back door was definitely the point of entry and exit, but something was hinky about it. The police entered the Von Stein's house and began searching for victims. Upstairs, they found 44-year-old Bonnie lying on the floor of her bedroom. The telephone was still in her hand, but Bonnie was losing blood fast. Later, it would be confirmed that Bonnie had suffered a stab wound to the chest, a collapsed lung, internal bleeding, a fractured thumb, and numerous cuts and bruises to her face. The police quickly determined that Bonnie's injuries were life-threatening, and they transported her to a hospital. 42-year-old Lieth Von Stein was on the bed. He wasn't breathing, and his heart had stopped. They had to wait for a doctor to make the final determination, but the police already knew. He was dead. Later, a medical examiner would confirm that Lieth had 5 lacerations on his scalp, 7 stab wounds in his back, and 1 stab wound in his heart. Additionally, Lieth sustained numerous bruises and scrapes as he tried to defend himself. But as soon as the attacker's blade had pierced his heart, Lieth was a goner. He had died within minutes of the blow. Angela, thank God, was fine. The police found her sleeping in her room, which was only about 12 feet away from her parents' bedroom. They woke Angela up and had her wait downstairs. There, they told her what was going on. Angela remained calm. Too calm, according to the police later, but I'm sure she was in some serious shock. When Angela called Chris, he was back in Raleigh playing cards with some friends. Upon hearing the news of this attack, Chris was incredibly distraught. He couldn't drive. He couldn't even find his keys. So he called the university police, and they gave him a ride to the hospital so he could see Bonnie. At the time, Bonnie was in the ICU. She would go on to make a full recovery, but despite several plastic surgeries, she would remain scarred from the attack. When she was doing better physically, investigators spoke with Bonnie to see if she could remember anything about the assailant. Unfortunately, because the room had been dark and she wasn't wearing her glasses, she couldn't identify him. Bonnie could only describe the person as appearing dark and bulky and being armed with a stick, club, or bat. He was dressed in dark clothing from head to toe and was wearing a hood or mask. When news of the attack on the Von Steins was made public, residents of Washington could not believe it. Murders were rare in the city, but they were unheard of in the Smallwood neighborhood. People were terrified a madman was on the loose. They installed deadbolts, kept their houses locked up tight, and loaded their guns. Meanwhile, the Washington police were trying to figure out who attacked Lieth and Bonnie Von Stein. This wasn't the easiest task for this particular police force. They had very little experience investigating a murder. Some describe them as being like Don Knotts' character, Barney Fife, from the Andy Griffith Show. But they tried their best. Remember, this was the epitome of a small town in the Low Country. They didn't even have 911. They definitely didn't have a CSI unit. There was an SBI rep on site who tried to call in the state team, but they were at a conference and he didn't have the authority to make them come. So the local cops did their best, but they would make a huge mistake. When the SBI rep named Lewis Young arrived on scene, he saw bloody bedsheets drying on a motorboat parked in the driveway. Neighbors stood in their own yards watching the police work. This was supposed to be a crime scene, and they already had evidence hanging outside for folks to gawk at. Also, they closed down their work that afternoon and opened the house up for neighbors to come inside and clean. The neighbors said they didn't want Bonnie to come home to this awful crime scene, but she was later angry about the police letting them in there. She felt like they were nosy looky-loos, not really trying to be helpful. And the police had not even taken a day to investigate the scene. I don't blame her for being pissed, and if she wasn't close to her neighbors, she was probably right about them just being nosy. So the place was scrubbed clean, and whatever evidence was left had been washed away before a real CSI unit could investigate. Luckily, a young Beaufort County detective, John Taylor, 28 years old with 4 years on the force and 2 years into his work as a detective, had the wherewithal to go ahead and pull out a camera and snap photos of the crime scene before things had been moved. After searching the Von Stein residence and the surrounding areas, police found that some hidden cash was missing and Bonnie's purse had been dumped out, but that was it. Because of the cash, this felt like a targeted inside job. To John Taylor, this looked like a planned murder, not a burglary gone wrong. A green backpack was recovered near the home, but that was it. Luckily, they quickly got a tip that led them to crucial evidence. A farmer had contacted the authorities. Around 4:30 a.m. on July 25th, the same time and day of the attack, he had seen a fire on the side of Highway 264. This was around 9 miles west of Washington. Police went to the area and found the remnants of burned clothing, the rubber sole of a Reebok tennis shoe, a knife, and a partially burned hand-drawn map of the neighborhood around the Von Stein home. The map would be a huge piece of evidence in this case. Officers showed the knife to the medical examiner, who confirmed It could have been used to attack the couple. It appeared police had found at least one of the weapons used during the attack. The baseball bat or similar item was yet to be located. Investigators kept coming back to the fact that whoever killed Lieth and severely injured Bonnie had to have known the family. The first two suspects were 18-year-old Angela and 20-year-old Chris, and they both had plenty of motive. If Bonnie and Lieth died, Chris and Angela would inherit the Von Stein estate. It was worth around $2 million back then. Today, that's about $5 million. But detectives wondered how Angela could have attacked her parents, cleaned herself up, and crawled back into bed before the first responders had arrived. And Chris had been 110 miles away in Raleigh, playing cards. His friends confirmed it. 5 weeks into the investigation, and the police were no closer to solving it. They hadn't even ruled out Bonnie, even though she was a victim, much less the kids. Bonnie couldn't believe she was a suspect, but that's just how it works when you stand to inherit that kind of money. She could have set the attack up and then been inadvertently injured as well. The police said they needed her and the kids to take a polygraph to clear them, to which she said, "Why didn't you just ask? We could have done this weeks ago." She and Angela passed, but Chris didn't take the test yet. Little did investigators know, but Bonnie Von Stein had hired the most famous criminal defense lawyer in North Carolina, Wade Smith. He had worked on the Jeffrey McDonald case. He sat second chair to McDonald's fancy New York lawyer and was the only one on the team who didn't rub the judge and jury the wrong way. McDonald may have lost, but Smith is still one of the most esteemed lawyers in the state. Bonnie had never liked the way the police had talked to her. She was the victim, the grieving widow, and when she told her dad about it, he suggested she hire a lawyer. Incidentally, Wade Smith is how author Joe McGinnis later got involved. Smith counseled her to get Chris his own lawyer. He felt like she and Angela were fine since they were in the house during the attack, but even though Chris had witnesses to his alibi, he still wasn't home when it happened. So she hired another big gun named Will Osteen Sr. When Osteen found out about the polygraph, he said absolutely not. He said he would set up a private polygraph, but Chris would not be taking any SBI test. When Bonnie showed up with Angela for the test and informed Lewis Young and John Taylor that on the advice of his attorney, Chris wouldn't be taking the test, they were flabbergasted and pissed. Bonnie had never mentioned hiring a lawyer. She told author Joe McGinnis that Young looked at her and said, "Why would a victim need a criminal lawyer?" Lewis Young certainly did not handle Bonnie with kid gloves. Instead, he blew up at her. According to what Bonnie told author Joe McGinnis, Young slammed a stack of papers on the table in front of her and told her he had planned to walk her through all the evidence they had, but now he would never talk to her about the case again. Whether or not he really believed she could be involved is immaterial. Today, she would have had a victim's advocate helping her navigate this horrible experience, not some state police guy with an ego bigger than North Carolina screaming at her. Back then, she had her own wits and the support of her family. And her dad wasn't wrong. When the cops want to talk to you, and especially if they're talking polygraph, you need an attorney, even if you are a victim. That's still true today. And little Bonnie Von Stein had quite the spine when pushed around by the cops. She didn't appreciate how they talked to her, and she let them know it. She and Angela took the polygraphs as promised and passed, ruling them both out. But Chris was still a suspect. Playing cards during the murder or not did not rule him out of planning the attack. Police knew for a fact he wasn't the actual killer, but it was possible he was still involved somehow. Investigators kept digging, hoping to find enough evidence to bring charges. Meanwhile, Bonnie never felt safe at home again, and she was anxious to get away from Little Washington. She now owned the house that had once belonged to Lieth's parents in Winston-Salem, so she and Angela moved there. By February 1st, 1989, there was a new sheriff in town, so to speak. Washington County had a new chief of police named John Crone, and he considered his first order of business the Von Stein murder. They had the map, and they had suspects. It was time to play hardball. Crone put together a task force with John Taylor leading and Lewis Young as an official player, despite his animosity towards the victim. The team took a fresh look at Chris Pritchard. Maybe he had planned the attack. That would explain why the killer had a hand-drawn map of the Von Stein's neighborhood. They got a subpoena and got a handwriting sample from North Carolina State. Chris had written his home address on an admittance card, and the team felt the word Lawson was a solid match to the Lawson Road written on the map. Now, investigators knew they were headed in the right direction, but they needed to find out who could have helped Chris pull everything off. So they looked closely at his friends. Chris spent the most time with his Dungeons & Dragons buddies, 19-year-old Gerald Neil Henderson and 19-year-old James Bartlett Bart Upchurch III. But Bart's friends called him Moog for some reason. Chris had met Moog when he answered a flyer on campus about playing Dungeons & Dragons. Moog had even met Angela, who visited Chris often at school. He supposedly had a crush on her. Neil and Bart were childhood friends who grew up in a small town near the Virginia state line. They were both really smart guys, big math and science nerds, Neil especially so. One of his teachers described him as a strange little genius. Neil's IQ was over 150, and when he took the SAT, he scored 1,500 out of 1,600, the highest SAT score Neil's hometown and county had ever seen. But Neil wasn't going to start any revolutions. He just wasn't the type. He never got into any trouble and was an agreeable guy, a follower, not a leader. Bart was intelligent too, just not as gifted as Neil. Bart had an IQ of 135, scored an 1190 out of 1,600 on the SAT, and was a gifted student. As a child, Bart did not show any violent tendencies. But he had been in trouble before. In February of 1986, Bart and 3 of his friends were caught stealing a TV, binoculars, and several other items from a cabin. They also stole a computer from the high school. For that, Bart was given 3 years of probation. But he didn't meet with his parole officers like he was supposed to, and eventually, he was picked up again for driving without a license. It had been revoked earlier for a traffic offense. As a result of all this, Bart was put on 24-hour electric monitoring, which means he had to wear a transmitter bracelet and adhere to a curfew. In August of 1988, just a few weeks after the Von Stein's attack, Bart sawed off his transmitter bracelet, and he stopped seeing his parole officer. He was officially on the run, but from what? Well, the Washington police suspected they knew exactly what. On June 9th of 1989, almost a year after Lieth and Bonnie were attacked, the police spoke with Neil Henderson. They wanted to see if he would squeal on Bart. They asked Neil if he knew where Bart was, but Neil claimed he didn't. He said he hadn't seen or heard anything about Bart since he went on the run, way back in August. The police then asked him if he knew anything about the Von Stein attack. And Neil did. Neil knew a lot about the Von Stein attack. And boy, was he ready to spill. His conscience had been killing him. 2 or 3 weeks before the attack, back in the summer of '88, Chris and Bart had approached him. They told Neil they had an idea, a plan for Chris to come into his massive inheritance early. Neil remarked, "Oh, you're going to rob the place?" Bart shook his head and said, "No, we're going to murder his parents." Neil replied, "Isn't that a little extreme?" But Chris laughed and said, "No, we're serious. Here, let us show you." Chris then brought out a hand-drawn map of the Von Stein neighborhood and explained the plan. Bart would kill the Von Steins, then stage the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. Chris would stay in Raleigh so he wouldn't be a suspect, but Bart didn't have a car or a driver's license, and he couldn't drive Chris's car because if he was stopped while driving the car without a license, the murder could be traced back to Chris. So, they asked Neil to drive Bart to the Von Stein home in Chris's car. Neil told investigators he agreed to go along with the plan because he wanted to fit in. For all of his life, Neil's high IQ had made him stand out. He said, "At the time, I didn't feel very good about myself, and I needed friends. They were my friends." On the night of Sunday, July 24th, Neil arrived at the campus parking lot. He picked up Bart, who had a green backpack, a hunting knife, and a baseball bat. He also had a key to the back door that Chris had given him. Neil asked about why Bart had brought the bat. Bart explained that he wasn't sure he would be able to stab the Von Steins quickly enough. The bat was there to knock them out. During the 2-hour drive from Raleigh to Washington, North Carolina, Bart changed his clothes. He put on black shoes, a dark shirt and pants, and a ski mask. Neil and Bart arrived at Little Washington at around 2:30 a.m. They located the Von Stein house and then drove around for a while. After a while, Bart told Neil to park the car, and then he got out and said he'd be back in 30 minutes. So Neil waited and waited. 30 minutes came and went, but Bart hadn't returned. Neil started to panic. He drove closer to the Von Steins' neighborhood to look for Bart. After about 10 minutes, he appeared. He was running toward Neil's car. Bart got in and said, "I did it. I can't believe I did it. I never want to see that much blood again for the rest of my life. Let's get out of here." Immediately, Neil drove away. After they were settled on a long highway, Bart told Neil to stop in a dark place. He needed to change his clothes. He was covered in blood. After he changed, Bart threw his bloody clothes in the trunk. A while later, Neil and Bart stopped at a dark, secluded spot on the side of the road. They made a pile out of Bart's murder clothes, the murder weapon, and the map of the Von Steins' house. Then, they dumped gasoline on the items and set them on fire. They left quickly before the fire burned out, which is how the map didn't burn. And then they stopped for gas and to wash the mud off the car. Bart gave Neil the cash he had stolen from the Von Stein home to buy gas. Neil then told the officers questioning him that he had stopped being friends with Chris and Bart after the attack. And Chris and Bart weren't friends anymore either, according to Neil. The whole situation had been too traumatic. They only ran into each other on occasion and always by accident. When Neil was finished confessing, he took the officers to all the places he had mentioned. He even gave them the baseball bat that Bart had hidden. With all of Neil's information, the police were confident in their case. And on June 15th of 1989, Bart, aka Moog, was arrested. The next day, on June 16th, Chris was also arrested. He had been staying at Bonnie's house in Winston-Salem. And on June 20th, Neil was arrested. A month later, Chris, Neil, and Bart were indicted on charges of murder, conspiracy, assault with a deadly weapon, burglary, and other charges. They faced the death penalty if they were convicted. Bart and Chris both pleaded not guilty. But Neil Henderson took a plea deal. In exchange for his testimony and a few lesser charges, Neil would be sentenced to a maximum of life plus 20 years. The death penalty was taken off the table. At his hearing, Bonnie had an extreme reaction. She thought he resembled the attacker more than Moog did. She even ran out of the courtroom scared. Later, it would make her testimony tricky. She wouldn't identify Bart, aka Moog, definitively. Chris was adamant that he was not guilty, until right before the trial started. Are we shocked that the death penalty spooked a spoiled 21-year-old kid? On December 27, 1989, Chris accepted the same plea deal as Neil. He would spend his life in prison, but he wouldn't face the death penalty. And then he confessed. He corroborated Neil's story exactly. And he also said more. Chris explained how he had first thought of killing his mother and stepfather. Around June of '88, Chris had been drinking with his friends. They were all shooting the shit about what they would do if they were rich. And during that conversation, someone brought up that Chris's parents were rich, which Chris confirmed. Then he said if something were to happen to his parents, he would inherit a lot of money. So, Chris and his friends began daydreaming about this inheritance money, how they could use it to buy a big house and all live together. Over the course of that summer, Chris became more heavily involved in drinking and drugs. He started to obsess about his parents' deaths and how much money he would get. On July 20th of 1988, Chris and Bart grabbed some dinner. During the meal, Chris asked Bart what he thought about patricide, and Bart replied apathetically saying, "Well, you better not believe in God." From there, Bart joined Chris in his scheme to murder his parents. They began planning the murders. In exchange for Bart's help, Chris would give him a Porsche and $50,000. That would be $125,000 today. Their initial plan was to drug the Von Steins and then set the house on fire. They would make it look like an accidental house fire by planting a broken fuse in the electric box. When investigators asked Chris if he was worried about Angela dying, Chris was unconcerned. He knew it was a possibility. He was okay with her dying, but he was also okay with her living. She wasn't the main target. On Friday, July 22nd, Chris went home with the intent of carrying out his and Bart's plan. That Saturday morning, when Chris told his parents he was out with friends, he actually drove to Raleigh, where he picked up Bart, who had a bunch of crushed sleeping pills. They returned to Little Washington that afternoon with the intent of drugging Bonnie and Lieth. That's why Chris wanted to cook the burgers that Saturday night. He was going to lace the food with the sleeping pills. And he did. But then things started to go wrong. Chris told his family he was headed back to Raleigh, and instead he drove to where Bart was waiting. They went back to the Von Stein house to start the fire, but they couldn't break the fuse that they were going to plant in the fuse box. Bart panicked. Plus, they had no way of knowing if the pills actually worked. He told Chris that the plan wouldn't work, and they both went back to Raleigh. On the way, they devised a new plan. Bart suggested that he and Chris chop off Bonnie and Lieth's heads. It would be quick and painless, Bart argued. But when the two men tried to purchase a machete, they couldn't find one. The Army surplus stores were closed on the weekends. Chris and Bart started brainstorming, and once again, they had a new plan. Kill the Von Steins in what would look like a burglary gone wrong. Chris said he needed to stay in Raleigh to establish an alibi, so Bart would have to carry out the murder by himself. They would ask Neil to be Bart's getaway driver since Bart didn't have a license. To stage the crime scene, Bart would steal a few things from the house, which is why the money from the secret stash was gone. On the morning of Sunday, July 24th, Bart and Chris went to Kmart and bought a hunting knife. Then they spoke to Neil about being the getaway driver. Chris offered Neil the same deal, a car and $50,000. Neil agreed, and the plan was in motion. When Chris received the phone call he knew was coming in the early morning of Monday, July 25th, he acted shocked. It wasn't until he saw his mother, beaten, stabbed, and terrified in the hospital, that he felt remorse. He was disgusted with himself, but he didn't confess. Chris was scared his mom would find out what happened, and he didn't want to go to jail. Bonnie later said prior to Chris's confession, she didn't believe he could commit murder. But after he told her he had planned the attack, she had to believe him. She said, "I can't imagine him telling me such a horrible story and him not doing what he said." Despite the fact that her son planned her murder and had killed her husband, Bonnie forgave Chris and supported him throughout his court proceedings. Another interesting part to Chris's confession to his mother, it happened months after he had already confessed to authorities. His attorneys didn't want his mother to know because she was supposed to be a character witness for Chris's defense. But ethically, the DA and police wanted Bonnie to know. Chris was living with her in Winston-Salem while out on bond. What if he tried to kill her again? Further, Chris was under the care of a psychiatrist who was worried that Chris was suicidal because he had not come clean to his mother. I'm no lawyer, but it doesn't seem right to put a witness on who doesn't know all the facts, ethically or legally. Bonnie Von Stein had a right to know. She had been an adamant supporter of her son and couldn't understand why he was charged in the attack. She considered the entire investigation a shit show, and it was. Bonnie read true crime books and loved watching crime shows on TV. She knew from the get-go that the crime scene was mishandled and that the police had bungled the investigation. Is it any wonder she didn't believe her son was involved until he finally confessed to her? When he finally did, it was a massive heartbreak for Bonnie. But as I said, she quickly forgave her son and intended to support him through his entire legal ordeal. But luckily, she wouldn't have to testify for him since he took a plea deal. Bart was the only one of the three men to not accept a plea deal. His trial began in early January of 1990. The prosecution told the jury that Chris, Bart, and Neil planned the murder of the Von Steins so they could make some fast, easy money. The motive was greed, plain and simple. Chris and Neil were star witnesses for the prosecution. Bonnie also testified, and she was probably Bart's only hope, as she would not positively identify him as her attacker. Bonnie's ethical streak was made of steel. She would not say something she didn't believe. But the jury had Chris and Neil, and that meant more than a traumatized victim's memory of that night. Without their testimony, Bart probably would have walked free. In fact, the defense's arguments pointed out that there was zero physical evidence linking Bart to the attack. They claimed that Bart could be innocent, that Chris and Neil, and perhaps even Angela, had framed him. But for all their hemming and hawing, this trial was pretty much open and shut. On January 24th of 1990, after deliberating for 10.5 hours, the jury found Bart guilty on all counts. After the verdict was read, Bart lowered his head and held back tears. But that was about the only emotion he showed during the entire proceedings. And I'm willing to bet it took the jury over 10 hours due to Bonnie's testimony. Next, the jury had to decide if they were sentencing Bart to death. The prosecution laid out all of the aggravating circumstances surrounding Lieth's murder and Bonnie's attack. First, the murder occurred during the commission of a burglary. Second, it was committed for money. And third, it involved violence against other people. All of these were considered aggravating circumstances that could justify the death penalty in the state of North Carolina back in 1990. The prosecution said that Bart should receive the death penalty because the attack on the Von Steins was, quote, a cold, calculated, pitiless, conscienceless act. Sentencing Bart to death was the only way you could assure that he wouldn't do it again, they said. The defense countered that Bart should receive life in prison because there were 11 mitigating factors that outweighed the aggravating. Mitigating factors included Bart's age, his use of drugs, the fact that he played Dungeons and Dragons, which, quote, created a blur between fantasy and reality. The defense also said it was unfair that Bart faced death while his co-conspirators got life in prison. A psychologist for the defense testified that Bart revealed an absence of violent tendencies and the presence of a primary mode of dealing with situations by denying feelings and thoughts. That could be why he was acting totally fine throughout the trial. He was in a deep state of denial. Bonnie told the judge, outside of the presence of the jury, that she didn't think Bart should be sentenced to death. She said, I don't believe that taking another life could make amends for the loss of Lieth. The defense wanted the jury to hear Bonnie's statement, but the prosecution objected and the judge sided with the prosecution. On January 30th of 1990, the jury recommended that Bart be sentenced to death, and the judge imposed the death penalty that same day. He was also given life for first-degree burglary, 20 years for felonious assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, and 6 years for felonious larceny and conspiracy to commit murder. After he was sentenced, Bart maintained his innocence. He said his trial was a miscarriage of justice, and that he was, quote, appalled and shocked by the verdict, and was surprised the jury had listened to 2 confessed murderers. Bart told the court he would try to end his own life by starving himself. That way, he would avoid being a burden on his family. He told the court, I'm not cattle to be fattened for slaughter. After this statement, the judge asked that Bart be put on suicide watch. Prison staff said they would force-feed him if necessary. But they didn't have to. Bart broke his fast by eating breakfast on his second day in prison. On January 31st, the day after Bart was sentenced to death, Neil and Chris had their sentencing hearing. Bonnie testified for her son, stating, I love Chris, as I'm sure the parents of Neil and Upchurch love them. I hope and pray that these 3 young men can someday find peace within themselves. Chris addressed his family and stated, You don't know the kind of mental anguish that I have gone through. I just want you to know I love all of you. Neil was given 40 years, while Chris was given life plus 20 years. In December of 2000, Neil was paroled after 10 years in prison. Today, he's a free man. He lives in the Raleigh area. Chris was paroled in May of 2007 after 17 years in prison. He's also a free man and a born-again Christian. You know ex-cons always find Jesus. Bart Upchurch's convictions and sentences were appealed. That automatically happened when the death penalty was given in North Carolina. During the appeals process, Bart's death sentence was overturned due to errors in sentencing instructions given to the jury by the judge. On September 22, 1993, Bart was resentenced to life in prison. Today, he is serving 2 life sentences in the Davidson Correctional Institute in Lexington, North Carolina. You might be wondering why I didn't discuss Dungeons & Dragons more in this episode, since that's one of the reasons this case was so famous. The reason is simple. It's bullshit. It is how Chris met Moog, aka Bart James Upchurch. They played Dungeons & Dragons, often while tripping on acid. Moog was his dealer, and they were friends who were obsessed with D&D, along with some other friends. But that's where it ends. The real motive was greed. This wasn't kids playing a stupid game that got out of hand. These were legal adults who made a plan after talking about how rich Lieth Von Stein was. A plan for Chris to inherit money, and then they could all drive cool cars, live in a house together, and play D&D to their heart's content. That's it. That's how much Dungeons & Dragons really had to do with this case. If you need more convincing than that, consider that Chris and his friends were fine with killing his mother. And Angela. Angela was just collateral damage, but in court, Chris admitted his inheritance would have been larger if she were killed too. I'm told that one of the big differences between Jerry Bledsoe's book and Joe McGinnis's is that Angela is more of a suspect in McGinnis's Crawled Out, that she might have helped and known what was going down. Maybe. Maybe her brother lied in court for her because he didn't see why she should go down for this too. Or maybe she just got lucky that Moog Upchurch once had a thing for her, so he didn't decide to attack her that night. There is no proof about Angela, and she did pass the SBI's polygraph. Not that those are admissible in court, but they are good enough to clear her for the cops. If she was involved, she got damn lucky. But I don't really believe she was. I think her greedy brother didn't really want her dead, but wouldn't mind it if it meant he didn't have to split his inheritance with her. No, this is a case about a smoldering resentment between a distant stepfather and a spoiled kid. And it's about money. That's it. Lieth wasn't really a father figure to Chris, and what Chris coldly planned did not bother his conscience until he saw his own mother in the hospital. So yes, this case is also about remorse. Chris regretted his actions once he saw his mother. But regret doesn't change anything, though his mother did support him through his journey through justice. Do they have a relationship now that he has gotten out? I don't know. I did read that Bonnie visited him on every single visitation day when he was in prison, so they did reconcile as far as I know. But I tend to leave survivors in peace at the end of a case. I understand Bonnie remains a very private person. Despite Chris's remorse, it's hard to believe he's out of prison, but Upchurch is still behind bars. I know he is the one who committed the murder, but he would not have been there if it wasn't for Chris Pritchard. Neil Henderson wouldn't have either. And Lieth Von Stein is dead at age 42. That used to sound so old to me. But really, he was a youngish, middle-aged man who was about to start a new life. He could have lived another 42 years. His bratty stepchildren were both about to be in college. He wanted to invest his money and travel for the first time in his life. He had been to Germany for war, but he still hadn't really seen the world. And he wanted to do it with Bonnie, the love of his life. He and his wife could start their lives anew. I'm not saying he was perfect. Most people aren't. But he did care about his family, and he loved his wife very much, and she loved him. And they both lost the lovely future he was planning for them. The future they were on the cusp of beginning. A future that was stolen in the dead of night by by a plan that their own son put into motion. It's more of a Greek tragedy than some silly Dungeons and Dragons tale. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank and myself, and of course, all editorial opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic artist by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brendan Schexnayder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. Thank you to Stephanie and Ainsley for suggesting today's case, and especially Ainsley for protecting me from the pronunciation police. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the Listener Suggestion tab or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. You'll get lost in a sea of emails if you send it to my main address, so this is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. With 3 platforms to manage, that is very overwhelming for me. I hope you understand. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds, but it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe, and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, and now Amazon and Audible. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.